Hi everyone, and welcome to today's Windows IT Pro web seminar, Hybrid Clouds, Azure, Real-World Use Cases, sponsored by Rackspace. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the Help widget on your player console to receive assistance in solving common issues. And if at any time you are having audio difficulties or issues with the advancing of the slides, simply hit the F5 key to refresh your webcast console. Today's web seminar is being recorded and will be available on demand for 12 months starting tomorrow. You will receive an email when it is ready. And with that, let's meet today's roundtable moderator and speakers. Jeff DeVerter will be moderating today's roundtable and is the Chief Technologist for Microsoft Technology at Rackspace. Kent Kingery is the Senior Manager of Cloud Engineering at Rackspace, and Jacob Saunders is the CTO for 10th Magnitude. And with that, Jeff, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Jen. Everyone, I want to welcome you to today. You've sat through a lot of webinars and such in the past, but today, really we're taking this more of a panel discussion because what we put together here is a group of folks who have really a ton of experience, and not just, lab experience. It's really a ton of experience in and around building real-world solutions for customers, both in private clouds and public clouds. And what we're going to talk about today are a few just real specific use cases. Really, they're a platform for us to be able to talk to you about ways that you can solve these challenges using cloud. Obviously, we're not going to hit everything in every scenario. If you have questions, I want to encourage you to start populating them inside of the console. And we'll get to those. We'll have a question and answer period there towards the end. And so we'll hit those there. We are making a list of them. We can see them in the little player console that we have here. And with that, what I want to do is step into a little bit more of an introduction so you can know a little bit more about those of us who are going to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour with you. So again, my name is Jeff DeVerter, and I've been with Rackspace for about 7.5 years. I've built several different businesses here inside of Rackspace, different departments, and they've started with a SharePoint offering, Exchange, what's now Skype for Business, our Microsoft Private Cloud, and also our Azure offerings. And so I have a lot of experience in helping customers get out of their data center and start to utilize another team that can help them manage and maintain that infrastructure, help architect it appropriately so that they can ultimately be something that can just be consumed and be used in helping them use that technology to move their business forward. And that's really what our primary focus here is to help you with your technology, to help you make your business move forward and not have to think as much about technology and let us handle some of that stuff for you. So we're great at it and a lot of experience in architecting these solutions and then ultimately in running them for you. So that's who I am. I come out of a deep enterprise architecture history with other enterprises here. We're actually in the San Antonio area and in the Texas area. So that's a little bit about me. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kent Kingery, and he'll tell you a little bit about himself and what he does for us here at Rackspace.
Hi, this is Kent. My role here at Rackspace is I'm the Senior Manager of Product and Engineering, so I have responsibility for shaping what we do with Azure and then the actual implementation of the pieces that we run on top of Azure, our customer portals, much of the things that we're doing to enable Azure at a higher level. I've been with Rackspace only about 6 months, but have been in the IT services industry for over 30 years. Gosh, it seems like a long time.
It is.
Started my career with IBM and have sort of been around the world in terms of IT and what we've done there. I've been working in the cloud space for a number of years and been working with Azure for quite a while. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the learnings that we've had and some of the things that we're looking forward to in the future. So, Jeff?
Awesome. Thank you, Kent. We're glad you're here today. And then over to Jacob Sanders, who is with a company called 10th Magnitude. And Jacob, I'll let you tell the fine folks at home a little about yourself and about 10th Magnitude.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. So my name is Jacob Saunders. As CTO, I lead 10th Magnitude's consulting and an engineering organization. I introduced our company a little bit as well. I think everybody on this call probably knows Rackspace. We might be an unknown name. We're a professional services firm, about 5 years old. We're the top driver of Azure consumption in the central U.S. and one of the top 3 nationwide. We're based in Chicago. We have clients across the U.S. and the world. And our core business is helping companies that do code focus on their core business by taking them to the cloud, improving their software testing and deployment pipelines, modernizing their applications, automating their infrastructure, fostering cultural and business process improvements, and designing cloud business strategies for them. Our partnership with Rackspace is allowing us to enhance our service offerings by offering Rackspace's fanatical Azure support and world-class operational management to our clients. And the flip side of that is that we're allowing Rackspace to offer its clients cloud onboarding, migration, and innovation services that fall outside of its traditional services offering, and helping them continue to guide those clients along their cloud adoption journey.
Excellent. Thank you, Jacob, for that. And so let's go ahead and step forward to the next slide. And I think it's important for us, before we talk about cloud-based solutions, is to put a little bit of definition around what we mean when we say cloud, because quite frankly, the term has been used a lot. And if we were to really just look at what does it mean in whole, well, quite frankly, cloud really is nothing more than somebody else's computer. Now, that computer can be a pretty fancy computer. It can be absolutely something running in a world-class data center. It can actually even be a series of computers that are put together with specific software that's providing a service. So in traditional IT, we think about an enterprise or a company that obviously everybody has IT needs. And the way we've done it forever is we dedicate a closet, we dedicate a floor in the building, we dedicate a unique building to this, and we put all the servers there. And inside of there, we work with, in the business side, we'll work with IT to provision and maintain those servers. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges in that and things that have to go right. It has to be cold in there so those computers don't melt. There's got to be great internet bandwidth that's always available through multiple providers. It's got to have not only very well-conditioned power, but power that's available when regular commercial power isn't. And these are problems and solutions that, quite frankly, don't have a whole lot to do with much technology, but are things that enterprises have had to think about for as long as computing has existed, and had to maintain, and quite frankly have absolutely nothing to do with most companies' core business in the way that they are able to earn the income that they do. But it's what's had to happen over time because it didn't exist anywhere else. But over time, different industries and different businesses have come along. Quite frankly, that's really where Rackspace has founded and has built up its level of support, and that is providing enterprise-level operational excellence to computing so that enterprises don't have to worry about that. Early days, it was very much for a lot of websites, but over time, over the past 18 or so years, we are taking on more and more of a company's computing needs. Now, that has looked a lot like what we call dedicated off-premise. And the only thing that's different between dedicated off-premise and traditional IT is, well, it's somebody else's data center. That's really what we're going to start to talk a lot about here, and that is somebody else's data center. At Rackspace, we have data centers all around the world, and we have dedicated areas, whether it's something as small as just a server and some firewall and storage, to entire racks, to entire rows, for running customer applications. And we handle all of those things that we mentioned earlier so that a company doesn't have to do that. And that's really what we called cloud for a good long time, because if something wasn't running in a customer's data center, well, that's really what they just kind of viewed cloud as. But as technology has grown, has shifted, in Rackspace we started back in 2006 building out a true, what we'll now call a cloud offering. And I'm going to define that as in gross areas as a shared off-premises model. And that means that we're now starting to share some aspect of that computing technology. For instance, that might be just sharing the compute. In other words, we're going to have a series of servers that we'll call hypervisors, and those hypervisors might have virtual machines from any number of different companies shared on that infrastructure. It may be shared storage, where large storage area networks are hosting storage for a number of different customers, or shared networking layers. And then customers even started to think about, well, we all use SharePoint. Let's use that as the bad guy for the moment. And Microsoft even recognized this. They saw the way that we were helping customers build world-class dedicated SharePoint environments and realized that there's a lot of companies that don't need all of the rigor and, quite frankly, the expense and effort that it goes to create dedicated SharePoint environments. So they built what was the business productivity suite that ultimately became Office 365, and part of that is SharePoint Online, where you can now just get SharePoint by the user, by the drink, if you will. And so they've taken the software layer, and now we're sharing the software and everything that goes on underneath it. Now, there are ways to define that. There are acronyms galore. That shared SharePoint, you can think of software as a service, because now we've taken software and we're delivering that software as a service. You can think about a big shared, let's call it a big shared SQL cluster, or a cluster of servers that are providing website functionality. Now we have a thing that we call platform as a service, where we've taken a platform and we've abstracted the servers and the storage and the networking. Now we're just delivering that platform as a solution, as a service to our customers. Or then, lastly, infrastructure as a service. We're working obviously a little bit backwards here from where we are today to how things sort of evolved, where we're now just providing servers, virtual machines out to companies, and they're not having to think about managing the underlying infrastructure, be it the compute, be it the storage, or be it the networking layer. And now that's infrastructure as a service. So we've gone from traditional IT to dedicated off-premises to shared off-premises, and then we've subdivided down the shared off-premises stuff and turned that into now the different infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. Of course, now we have all sorts of other as a services that are showing up, but for the purposes of our conversation today, those are, I think, the definitions that will be the most beneficial to us. Excellent. Well, with that said, there are an awful lot of things that customers struggle with and companies struggle with when starting to think about moving out into, specifically in this case, let's talk about Azure. And Jacob over at 10th Magnitude, when we think about people struggling with complexity of how to scale an app, well, Jacob, that's really your guys' bread and butter. That's really what you staked your claim on and your name on, and that's helping customers be successful there. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So scalability and elasticity is one of the big promises of the cloud, and it's important to understand that it's possible to achieve that, but it's not automatic. The term auto scale is very appealing, but let's break down what scaling really means. There are two kinds of scaling, right? There's horizontal scaling, which means adding more servers, and vertical scaling, which means taking servers that are too small and making them larger. So if you look at platform as a service within cloud, horizontal scaling is built in. But if you have a custom application or a content management system that's running on a bunch of virtual machines, how do you add nodes to that web farm, and how do you make that farm aware of those nodes? And depending on your system, that may be something that's easy to achieve, that may be something that requires code changes, that may be something that requires configuration changes to take place. So it's something you have to design and engineer for. Vertical scaling is even trickier. So if you think of a workload that doesn't scale well horizontally, like a database server. So let's look at SQL Server, for example. If you're running a SQL Server cluster, you only have one active node, and so adding a whole bunch of servers to that is going to help your high availability and disaster recovery story, but it's not going to help your performance. So in order to scale a database cluster, you have to size each node. You have to shut down a node to do that. You have to fail over to your other node, then scale the first one. And in order to even achieve that, you have to know which types of virtual machines will scale into which other types of virtual machines. So it's possible, but it's not something that just happens automatically by going to cloud. Now, especially within Azure, there's some pretty cool new features and products like elastic scale database pools that are great for multi-tenant applications. Azure DW, which is a massively parallel database environment where you can just throw more compute nodes at it. and a couple of other products that can help overcome those challenges. But it's non-trivial to sort through all of that. And you know, in addition to cloud, basically you need smart people and smart engineers specifically in order to actually achieve that elasticity and help cloud make true on that promise.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, it's the promises of cloud can sometimes be viewed as the lies of cloud because it's, you know, yeah, it's a feature that's there, but it's not something that pops automatically. Awesome. So another challenge here is actually finding people who know how to do that. I think there are 3 experts in the world. You may be on the phone with the 3 of them right now, and we're experts because we just said we were. But the reality is finding the right help and keeping that help can be hard. Kent, in your experience, especially at Rackspace, but also in your previous roles, you've been on the hiring end of trying to find the right folks. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, you know, it's an interesting problem that companies have around this, and it seems to be somewhat specific to the technology space. We saw this back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where there was a huge talent war going on around internet capabilities, you know, the web, et cetera. And then we went through a period of a lull where it didn't seem like we had that much sort of battling for folks, and now we're back at it again. And companies really have a couple of choices, right? One is organic growth of their own people, so they're retooling folks, they're training folks to do something different than they were, or there's talent acquisition. And if you take a look at talent acquisition, the challenges that you have are fairly simple to understand, but they're pretty important. Number one, can you even find the people that you want to hire? How many Azure folks or Azure qualified folks are there? Certainly today, there are more of those folks than there were 6 months ago, and certainly way more than there were even a year ago. And if you roll forward a couple of years, I fully expect there to be more and more as the platform becomes adopted more broadly, and you just have more people that are making that as a career path. So can you find them? Can you afford them? That's always the second one, right? Is can you afford them? Can you afford to put the effort into getting their salaries, their benefits, all that kind of stuff? Can you keep them busy? If they're in and they're sort of in there, you're making one cloud move or you're making a certain type of workload for them, can you keep them busy full time? Can you keep them current? Because the environment, the Azure environment changes all the time. 6 weeks ago, it was different than it is today. In another 6 weeks, we'll have even more. And then finally, can you keep them, period? Yeah. Can you even keep them retained? Because as more and more people start to look for this kind of talent, you have to figure out a way to get them, retain them, train them, all those kinds of things.
Absolutely. We saw this back in the SharePoint space when it became so popular, but it just was hard to find the right smart people, and those that you could find they weren't cheap. And so we trained up a bunch of folks out of the system administrator group, and they deployed a SharePoint or two from a farm perspective, and now they're worth 20% more on the open market. Just crazy hard to keep them. The other challenge we hear a lot from customers is they're concerned about their investment that they've made in Azure. With what they've put there, there's just the comparison of what they're used to using from a server or a VM perspective, and now looking at the services and capabilities that exist inside of Azure. Even just choosing the right VM size. Are they bought too big? Are they spending more than they should? Those are some of the things that having the right folks can help. It's one of the things that we really help with at Rackspace. I know that it's a major part of the engagement that Jacob and the team over at 10th Magnitude do, and that's just really spending a lot of time on what is the right architecture for the budget and for the workload. And then risk of application downtime. We have a lot of customers at Rackspace who have a lot of infrastructure and gear here, and it's not just about infrastructure and gear. That's one of the things that really sets Rackspace apart, and that is the fact that we are watching and proactively thinking about that infrastructure and how to make sure that it, one, stays happy, and then two, based on current trends, remains that way. But you move out to an Azure or other like cloud, and you lose that touch, you lose that ability to pay attention to those things. And it's one of the things that companies really need to think about as they go from either on-prem, from a Rackspace, or from any other company that's like a Rackspace from a managed hosting perspective, and think, who's going to do that work out in the cloud? Because while there is software to enable those capabilities, there aren't people paying attention to those applications. And performance bottlenecks. Again, Jacob and the guys over at 10th Magnitude, this is something they really focus on, because as you look at, hey, I have a VM running on a Hyper-V server over at in my data center, I'll just get a VM over in Azure and the skies will not be cloudy all day. I imagine that's your solution, right, Jacob? Or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I think this one goes back to what I was talking about in the first bullet on this slide, right? Struggling with the complexity of scaling apps and data in the cloud. So there's not only work you need to do on the infrastructure side to make that work, but if you're retooling an application that that was designed to run on a traditional database server, for example, retooling that to take advantage of MPP capabilities or some of the NoSQL type solutions that lend themselves well to cloud scalability sometimes requires fairly significant changes to those applications. And we deal with a lot of clients that have brittle monolithic applications, and so turning those into architectures that are more loosely coupled, whether that's through microservices architecture or other kind of architectural redesign efforts, is often a prerequisite to really getting that scalability out of the cloud. I also want to jump back to the underutilized investment. So I think that's an interesting one, right? So as we've seen the marketplace and specifically Microsoft's business model evolve more into a consumption-driven model, we see customers that have legacy chunks of cloud that they've purchased. And those may have come along with a big Office purchase or some other large license investment in the past, and just kind of been tacked onto those. And so we do a lot of work with clients to figure out how to best consume that, how to get the most value out of those investments. And we do that through workload analysis, compatibility, business value of those workloads, interdependency analysis, and really building a roadmap that allows those clients to take that kind of dormant investment and drive some good ROI out of it.
Well, and I think this is Kent. I think it's interesting to know too that all these 5 things. Jeff, you made the comment earlier about the cloud lies. Let's use the word misconception, right, to make it a little less pejorative. But if you think about the misconceptions that people get of the cloud, especially if you read the popular press, sort of the American Way magazine in the air or whatever, talking about cloud, there's a huge misconception that you literally can just do that lift and shift without any sort of preparation planning, any sort of understanding about what kind of people you're going to need, what your issues are going to be around your application itself, what does the design have to look like if you're moving to platform as a service versus IaaS, et cetera. So I think that there is a huge opportunity for individuals and organizations to start to examine these sort of 5 pillar areas and be able to prepare better for the movement. Especially, this just gets magnified in a hybrid cloud environment. In the hybrid cloud environment, you're not only dealing with your own on-prem or somebody else's data center, but you're potentially dealing with the public cloud component in Azure. Then it simply just multiplies the things that you have to be aware of. So.
Excellent. Perfect. So, these are absolutely things that have got to be thought through and really thought about, because if you don't do that, let's go down to the worst case scenario. Hey, we're getting out of our own data center. We're going to enable this subscription. We're going to give our major department heads that utilize technology access to that subscription. And
that sounds so alluring, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like you want to do it tomorrow.
Hey, so I can get rid of a couple of IT people who are normally provisioning servers, even the guys who are procuring this stuff. We're saving money. Isn't that great? Right. Now what you've done is you've taken and given keys to the kingdom to buy infrastructure to people who don't have to pay the bill. Right. This is a problem.
Absolutely.
You've got to really think through that. All right, let's get into a solution and talk about something there. So if we wouldn't mind advancing the slides for me, I'm going to go back to my roots a little bit here and just talk about utilizing both public and private cloud, and go back to our earlier description, on-premise data centers and infrastructure as a service and software as a service running in the Microsoft Azure cloud, and talk about it in the context of SharePoint. Jack, I cut my teeth in the IT world, really focused very much on the Microsoft tool set, but then very quickly deep into the SharePoint space. I've been playing with it since its earliest days, building service offerings on it from as early as the 2003 space. and all the time, I mean, just preaching the message that this stuff needed lots of infrastructure, it needed lots of very low latency when we talk about communicating back to the SQL clusters that we're holding the data. We need lots of redundancy, and you know, this ultimately translated into a lot of gear. And you know, that was good. It was required. You know, we bit the bullet because we had to, because SharePoint, quite frankly, just solves a lot of problems that business departments inside of businesses had, and they had to deal with. And SharePoint was able to actually enable them to solve some of these things on their own or get access to information a little bit quicker. You know, the problem was you end up in these, and Microsoft really felt this, you know, these 3-ish years of software updates. It caused massive challenges when it was update time of how do we take the last version to get to the new version, how do we train the people that we're, you know, fighting tooth and nail from an infrastructure perspective to keep. Now I've got to train them into a new version, and doggone it, now they're worth more on the open market, and we've got to work hard to keep them. And so this was, I talked about this a little bit earlier, it's where Microsoft really started to say, you know, as a service may be a way to go. And so not just a way to go. So they put the BPOS, the Business Productivity Office Suite out, and it was a great first shot at it, quite frankly. They learned a lot. They learned how to run a data center. They learned very well how to run a data center in those years. And they learned how to patch and update at scale. They learned the frustrations that customers have with software and with trying to maintain and keep a customer productive with that software. And that eventually evolved into Office 365. Now, Office 365 we think of today primarily as a place where you can get some good, you get, you know, what, a 50 gig email box and they never delete anything, and that's awesome because I used to have to get that my own enterprise, and they only gave me 500 meg. I wish I just had 500 meg now.
Does your email box fit in 50 gig today?
Yeah. No. But there's so many other capabilities in there. Yes, there is SharePoint Online. And what Microsoft has started doing, I like to call SharePoint Online as a great beta for SharePoint because they throw all the new capabilities there, not just in SharePoint, but all the other things that are there. And some of them stick very well, which ultimately then become these updates that will, like what we've started to see in beta 2 with SharePoint that was just released this week. And we'll see in the SharePoint 16 as it comes out next year. But they started to build other components. And those other components just aren't static inside of Office 365 because Office 365, for better or worse, runs utilizing a vast majority of what Azure is. And in the coming years and coming updates, it will run completely on top of Azure. So that means that a lot of the underlying mechanisms have Azure dependencies. So we start thinking about a company that wants to use Office 365. Identity now has to be part of the conversation. It's not just, hey, give me some SharePoint. It's how do I take this on-prem solution and on-prem service, enable it over in Office 365, and still have a single identity that my employees are going to log in with on a day-to-day basis. Well, by utilizing Azure Active Directory, you have a way to do that. Now it takes some additional capabilities, what we used to call DIR-sync or directory synchronization, combined with or using exclusively federation services, where we're taking capabilities of Active Directory that run on-prem and now spreading that out into Azure Active Directory. By enabling Azure Active Directory with those single identities, we can now light up services in part or in whole. For instance, we can keep the SharePoint running on-prem for those things that require a dedicated implementation. For instance, data that might be part of executive communication, or that of a legal nature, or HR, or things that the company just decides, whether even if it's just straight IP that they want to make sure stays there and stays controlled. But you know, the pictures from the company picnic, the planning for way early planning for how teams are going to organize internally, to just the general team communications, absolutely makes great sense to run out in the cloud. If we start thinking about SharePoint running out online, then we've got to think about how are we going to have common search results. Well, SharePoint Online has the ability to handle that and be able to provide a single search result set that shows data that's both on-prem as well as what's out in the cloud. And you can also start to utilize things like OneDrive for Business, where today in a dedicated SharePoint implementation, whether that's running a single tenant on-prem or in a like a Rackspace data center where it would still be single tenant dedicated, you've got these My Sites, and My Sites are a place for me to just dump my stuff. It's my shared drives where I put things. We're putting that into SQL, which is arguably the most expensive storage that gets architected anywhere. Not the greatest solution, but if we enable Office 365 with my dedicated on-prem or Rackspace SharePoint environment, we can now start utilizing OneDrive for Business and let Microsoft handle and manage that terabyte of storage out inside of their data centers, which is still highly secured, and use that in conjunction with our dedicated implementation. So we start to think about other solutions that exist outside in the greater Office 365 and Azure footprint. Because we've spread that identity out there and because we have those licenses, we can start thinking about things like utilizing Azure as a way to have a disaster recovery story for our dedicated SharePoint implementation. You see, today, if a customer comes and asks us for that for something that's hosted at Rackspace, or if you're solving for that in your own or a customer's data center, well, the reality is you're doing a one-for-one buy on infrastructure, plus you're buying synchronization software or replication software that's going to move stuff from site A to site B. And that all takes management, it takes attention, it takes monitoring, and more than that, it takes money because you got to buy all that stuff to just sit on the sidelines. Well, with Azure Site Recovery, you have the ability to replicate machine roles running on-prem or at a Rackspace and replicate that out into Azure and just sit idle until the time comes that it's needed. And then one last little bit I'd like to talk about as well when we think about how we've extended this dedicated on-prem environment out into the Microsoft Cloud is the App Gateway service, Application Gateway. Now I can proxy out a site or a page or a section of my SharePoint out to the world. Let's say maybe a B2B solution that's handling purchasing for a vendor. And we want to expose that out to the world, but I don't want to expose my servers. It's always a scary thing to let your webheads be accessible through a public interface in some fit or fashion. It gets your security department all sorts of worked up. But if we start proxying these applications through the App Gateway, then we can actually extend some of that functionality out to the rest of the world outside of our firewall without actually exposing those machines to to the bad people of the world, and we don't like those bad people. So that's one solution, that when we start thinking about a traditional workload that's like SharePoint that's running on-prem, how can extending out into Azure and ultimately 365 help not only expand the services, but give you a greater degree of security through disaster recovery solution and enable you to utilize additional services as well. All right, with that said, let's step over to Jacob and to talk about deployment, because with what they do, and it's my chance to actually brag about Jacob. He was very modest before, but one of the things that they do astoundingly well is helping customers transform from a traditional IT model to a CI/CD or continuous integration and deployment methodology, and how that intermingles with both public and private clouds. So Jacob, I'm going to hand that off to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so I think one of the interesting developments that we've been seeing lately is that if you kind of disregard the Facebooks and Etsy's and these cloud native firms and think about traditional enterprises like law firms and banks and manufacturing, beginning to seriously adopt the cloud. I mean, we're finding that almost all of our clients are implementing hybrid topologies. So most of those enterprises that are beginning to move to the cloud have some legacy systems that either can't move to the cloud for technical reasons or for business reasons, right? So think of banking systems like check printing, proximity trading, industrial automation, and plant control systems. And they also can't move everything at once. So cloud adoption is generally a gradual process. For existing Microsoft customers, and you touched on some of these capabilities, but Azure is a natural platform that allows them to extend that corporate environment into the cloud. You mentioned Azure Active Directory and Identity as a Service, platform as a service components like the IoT suite, the ability to manage with System Center, and as well as Microsoft's legacy of innovation. So Amazon is strong on the infrastructure as a service side, but started off as a retailer with extra server capacity, not an enterprise software company with products like SQL Server, CRM, SharePoint, and Office that could be turned into cloud products. So those traditional enterprises, one of the most common entry points that we see for them into the cloud is moving their development and testing environments into the cloud. So if you can imagine a scenario where development environments and test environments can be spun up on demand, destroyed on demand, cost controlled, and have those costs aligned with the SDLC. So for example, think of a performance testing environment that is identical to a production environment, which is pretty rare. We've all been in IT long enough to know how frequently that actually happens. Well, if you can create that environment and destroy that environment at will, that actually becomes a realistic scenario. So a lot of folks think that those capabilities are what cloud gives you, and that's not necessarily true out of the box. You can swipe your credit card and create a whole bunch of servers, sure, but how do you ensure that they're all configured properly? How can you ensure that they're hardened? As you deploy and redeploy and redeploy and redeploy your code to a certain set of development servers, how do you know that those configurations aren't getting out of whack? And how do you know what kind of gunk is being left behind on those servers from all those dozens or hundreds of deployments over time? So one of our clients is a big ISV in the legal e-discovery space. As of last year, they had 62 environments, 995 servers, and each one of those servers was raised from young, as they put it. So they were individual named pets, each one of which required troubleshooting and maintenance, needed patches to be kept up to date. And there was no way to ensure that all those servers were the same. You think you can replicate an environment, but how do you know for sure it's going to be the same? How do you know that you went through all of the checklist steps in the same order? So when we looked at what was slowing down their development and what was their real need? Their real need was to increase time to market and increase the speed with which they were able to deploy their innovation to their clients. And it turned out that configuration management was the slowest link in that chain. So troubleshooting was hard. We've all heard the code works on my desktop. I don't know why it doesn't work in dev, or it works in dev. I don't know why it works in test. And that's what they were trying to get rid of. So they adopted a tool called Chef. And that handled configuration management that allowed them to automate the deployment of those environments and reduce not only the time it took to create those environments, but by defining those environments in code, was able to reduce the number of errors in those deployments, allow more junior staff to bring them up. So rather than having your absolute top infrastructure resource responsible for standing up these big and expensive environments, if they're described in code, you can have somebody junior do that and allow those senior folks to focus on stuff that's more strategic. And then beyond that, once everything's up and running, whenever an environment is broken or is out of spec, a tool like Chef or Puppet or Ansible, whatever that tool is that you're using, is able to detect that and fix it. So DevOps gives you configuration management, and it turns your target environment into a pattern rather than a series of complex checklists. And in doing that, it frees your code from the platform it runs on and allows you to deploy it wherever it's the most cost-effective, the most secure, the most scalable for whatever your needs are. It automates deployments so they're consistent and repeatable, and allows you to do things like deploy to public and private cloud at the same time. So if you look at this slide here, we have an example topology here with development and testing running on the left in an Azure cloud. We have an on-premise data center. That could be two on-premise data centers. That could be two different clouds. That topology on the right could be Azure technologies running within a Rackspace colo, for example. The point is that you're freed up to make those choices because your code is no longer tied to these difficult to configure, expensive to maintain, and almost impossible to troubleshoot servers. And so that process of going through a DevOps transformation takes away one of the biggest roadblocks to cloud adoption, which is, heck, I've got this big environment. It's running, I'm running all of this code across 500 servers. I don't know what state those are in, and in order to pick that up and move it somewhere else, I'd have to individually move each one of those servers over, and if they're not working, I don't know why. And so really DevOps allows you to take away that fear, allows you to take away that concern, and deploy your code where it needs to be and where it's cost effective.
Excellent, Jacob. Thanks for that. It brings the question up in my mind, though. I mean, this is a beautiful idea, and I think about the ability to utilize developers all over the world in a common cloud-based development environment, but yet run it in production on-prem. But to the company that is used to the traditional develop, even in some cases not even a sprint, but a long development cycle, and then ultimately deploy. Can you? This is off the cuff question, guys. I may stump them here. What are the steps that a company needs to think through to take to start to work in this direction? How does somebody who's not doing this today ensure that they can start making the right steps and not just throw caution to the wind and whip out an Azure subscription?
Well, so the most important thing to understand is that DevOps is a process of continual gradual evolution, right? So it's not something you adopt in a big bang. It's not something you go out and buy. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking that means that treats an application as custom code, but also the platform apps that run underneath that. Also the operating systems and even the virtual machines that run underneath that. And so that holistic view of an application, when you get to a mature implementation, allows you to deploy your infrastructure along with your code and test that holistically. It takes a while to get to that nirvana state. And so there are a lot of different entry points for DevOps, and really it's based on what your pain is. So if you have pretty good software, automated software testing processes in place, and you're pretty happy with your deployment pipeline, and your builds tend to go well, and you're able to deploy as frequently as you'd like to bring your innovation to market, well, then maybe that isn't the right place to start. Maybe the right place to start is in looking at automating your infrastructure and describing your infrastructure as code. Conversely, if you've already adopted cloud and your infrastructure is described and automated, whether that's in PowerShell and desired state configurations, or whether that's in Chef, and you're pretty comfortable that you have repeatable processes there, well then maybe the changes you start making are to your custom code deployment pipeline to tie that into how that infrastructure is deployed. So whether you pick a set of infrastructural workloads, or whether you pick a particular one of your software products or a particular code base and start making improvements there, you're already starting to change that mindset. You're already starting to change your culture, and you can take the experiences from those first steps and broaden them out to the rest of your organization. So it's not something to be afraid of. It's not something that you need to implement in one big chunk. Whatever your current environment is, whatever your current process is, there are incremental improvements that you can start making today that start to push you along that path, and that become a self-reinforcing virtuous cycle.
Perfect. Incremental. I think that's the magical word here. I think with that, let's jump over to Kent now to talk about another solution and around DR and whatever else you want to talk about here. Sure. But incremental is a magical word when we think about moving to the cloud.
Well, and I think I like to describe it as a journey, and I think there's a lot of companies that are on that journey. Where they are in the arc of that journey is different, sometimes depending on the industry, sometimes depending on the size of the company. And while this slide really talks about hybrid with DR, really the same sorts of capabilities and ideas are about any sort of hybrid scenario, whether that's bursting for capacity or whether that is geographic extension of your applications, etc. This particular diagram sort of builds on the diagram you showed earlier, Jeff, which is more about the ASR side and how do we use ASR to replicate. The SharePoint example that you brought up, I mean, there are quite a number of different capabilities around the SharePoint environment. You can go from Microsoft Hyper-V from one site to another. So let's say you have a data center in one side of the country, a data center in the other. You can use ASR to actually move and replicate your VMs from Hyper-V to Hyper-V. You can actually do the same thing, oddly enough, with VMware. That's relatively new. And then physical servers, even being able to replicate a physical server environment from one data center to another or from your site to Azure. All of those capabilities are there. And the key piece to note about this is that that big red double-headed arrow in the middle there is really the data channel that is connecting, your two locations. What really goes into Azure Site Recovery to address some things is really just the metadata about the environment. It's really not any of the environment data itself. And so that ability for that to move through ASR, through the site recovery process, while still having all of your sort of sensitive data, your private data being secured in your data channel, right, will be handled there. One of the things I wanted to talk real quickly about was just sort of a real world scenario around something like a benefits company, right? You think about a benefits company, and the way that they typically operate is they sort of manage benefits all through the year. They sort of handle things, but the real crush for a benefits company, especially one of any size, is right now during sign up for the next year. And we're going through that here at Rackspace. Yeah. We certainly are just went through it at Rackspace. And you can imagine that when employees are trying to sign up, the last thing that company wants is an issue where they can't get to the benefits sign up, especially for all those people like me that put it off till the last day. And so now there's a crush of people trying to sign up and get that done. The ability for this to be not only a disaster recovery environment, but also a capacity expansion environment helps us out tremendously. And if you think about the way Azure, especially from a public cloud perspective, has sort of structured their data centers and sort of where they are, the ability for that to move across geographic regions and be available in that environment makes it even more attractive. One of the other things to think about too, though, is that, and this comes up because I hear it a lot of times when talking to banking customers, which is kind of one of the industries that I've worked in for years and years and years. You hear banking companies, banking organizations really talk about three things. They're really concerned about security. Look, it's my money in the bank. I don't want anybody getting in there to deal with it. But at the same time, they also have regulatory and compliance things they've got to be careful about as well. Everybody who's ever dealt with personalized information or any of that knows that there's all kinds of laws just and sort of twisty-turny passageways that you can get yourself into real trouble with in this area. But the third one is really around availability, right? I mean, all of those things being equal, the availability side is important. We've gotten used to this sort of always on, always available environment. I get upset, if I go to my banking application and I can't get immediate information. And so the ability for us to use a hybrid solution in order to be able to handle that capacity or that disaster recovery is critical. And if you take a look at the diagram, what you see here is the ability for us to deal with the hybrid nature of compute, the hybrid nature of storage, the hybrid nature of networking. How do I get that back and forth? And the hybrid nature of Active Directory or identity. And Jeff, you know that we're in the process right now of looking at identity capabilities and what does that mean to have managed identity and managed capabilities across it. I do want to say one thing though that is interesting to me. It is a sign of the times. If you take a look at some industries 20 years ago, the regulations and the regulatory around them were really designed for a model, a business model that was, a few decades old. And now what we're starting to see is the more the adoption of cloud happens, and in banking industry is again another great example. You hear the scary stories, you hear the terrifying stories about what happened in the cloud. But as far back as July of 2013, right, Dutch banking regulators made it possible for banks in that country to be able to put many of their systems in the cloud environment, whether it was hybrid or standalone. Things like credit risk analysis, things like mobile apps, even retail banking, things that, trust me, if you'd have told me even 5 years ago that somebody was going to make a move on that, I would have figured we were 20 years away.
Right.
But it's a sign that there's a trust that's developing, there's a realization that's developing that this sort of hybrid environment, again, the ability to disaster recover or the ability to get capacity is just simply going to be table stakes. It's the cost of doing business in this brave new world, this availability sort of moniker that we put on it. So.
Do you think, so off the cuff, what do you think has been the big driver that has allowed companies who you just, like you said, 20 years, you think we got 20 years till they're going to start to light up some of these banking services. What has changed in society? This is not a technical question, but what has really pushed us to the point where we're comfortable with that?
So I think a few things. I think time to market to get things in place has pushed some organizations, it isn't just banking, has pushed organizations to the cloud because they believe, and rightly so, that there are ways that they can be quicker and more nimble by being in the cloud. I think there are just the cost advantages in some cases, operational advantages. I mean, I think all of those things are happening because I think you pointed out when we very first started this conversation, there's a 3 to 5 year horizon, right, on some of this stuff. You go put a rack of servers in your data center, you're committed for at least a while. It's not something you're going to use for a year in eBay after a year. You're really going to have a commitment around that. Whereas in the cloud environment, you're going to spin that stuff up as you need it, and Jacob's pointed that out in the DevOps space. You spin it up as you need it, you throw it away when you don't need it, and you do that with a fair degree of flexibility and again, nimbleness that we just don't have or didn't have 10 years ago. So.
Well, and I think one of the other things that has been a big driver is we've all gotten used to our Gmail. We've all gotten used to Maps. We've all gotten used to the stock ticker always being updated for things that are ours. We, and Amazon now with 1 hour delivery on some things, we are an impatient species at this point. And so what's happened is it's driven organizations and it's driven governments to make decisions that, we're going to have to loosen up some of this stuff, but actually push some of the onus back onto the companies and service providers to be able to ensure some of the things we've written into law before, but now we're changing. But to that end, I'll throw this back to Jacob. What it's done now is it's caused companies to have to think about how do I get away from, Microsoft had to do this. They had to get away from a 3-year development cycle on SharePoint and get to a 90-day feature release. Absolutely. But 90 days in a DevOps world, Jacob, that's a lifetime. Companies are now having to think about how do I go from 3 years to 90 days to a 9-day sprint.
Or to 9 hours in terms of pushing things out.
Things out. So, Jacob, I'm going to throw that back over to you. Are you seeing demands coming, not just because it's a nice idea, but because companies are actually being driven in that direction?
Yeah, I think so, right? I mean, it's becoming a competitive consideration. So certainly for software as a service firms and ISVs, if they want to be able to compete and if they want to be able to keep up with their competition, they're going to have to reduce that time to market, and they're going to have to increase their velocity. But even in more traditional industries like banks, so there's a banking a core banking system software vendor in Europe called Temenos, and we've started to run into them. They're looking to push into the U.S. market. And they're actually offering traditional banks cloud-based core banking software, and so that's a fundamental shift. And if you look at their website, right, they're doing a profitability analysis across their client banks, and they're showing a 42% higher return on capital. Now, of course, that's marketing speak from somebody's website, but a lot of our banking clients are looking to implement either that platform or a variety of other kind of cloud-based core banking solutions. not to realize incremental IT cost savings, but to fundamentally change their profitability as a business. And I think that flexibility and that elasticity, that shift away from managing a whole bunch of on-prem hardware when, honestly you're a bank, not a data center operator, is going to be a core business driver for a lot of traditional companies. And I think those companies that stick with that traditional CapEx model, that stick with those hard to predict hardware purchases are going to be left behind by their competition, whether those are forward-thinking software development firms or manufacturers.
Totally agree. So we're running a little bit short on time, but I want to grab one of the questions that I see in here, and I think I'm going to surmise it relatively easily. What's the first step that a company can take, Jacob, in 20 words or less, of how do I start running down this road of continuous development and deployment?
So it's look at, start with the thing that's easiest to improve, so that you can get comfortable with the technologies and you can get comfortable with the process. And then immediately after you've tackled the easiest thing, find the thing that's causing you the most business pain and start addressing it. And if you take that route, if you get familiar in something that's low barrier to entry, and then immediately take away something that's causing clearly quantifiable business pain, it's really easy to build a business case around that, calculate ROI, and get executive buy-in. So I would say start there.
Excellent. One of the other questions I see in here that I'm going to throw over at Kent is, when I think about operationalizing, moving to the cloud, how do companies, what are some recommendations or things you would throw out there around securing that data, that compute, that communication? Again, 20 words or less.
Sure.
Short.
So almost every company that moves this is going to be concerned about encryption. They're going to be concerned about security at the perimeter, what would be handled by traditional firewalls, traditional security devices, things like multi-factor authentication. And I think that you have to sit down and start to develop a philosophy around not only what has to be secured, but in what way. Because there's a lot of different ways to secure data, secure information, secure your channels. And I think by having a comprehensive plan, and most organizations, look of any size, have a security person that they put into place to figure this out. Yeah. And then it's just a question of marrying up the feature matrix with what are the features in something like Azure that can actually enable that.
Perfect. So, there's also another question in here, and is what is the perfect roadmap to getting to the cloud from identity, storage, and compute? And that I say, not within expecting an answer from either of you, because there really isn't one. I'm going to field this and say it depends on so many different things, but there are certain things you have to think about. If there is one topic that you would recommend to the question, the asker here, of a guidepost or a thing to consider, for me it would be, and it's to the question I just posed to you, how am I going to ensure that my data is secure? And I'm going to define data secure by I'm not going to lose my job if it leaks. So I would say have a plan for data security and data retention. So Jacob, I'm going to throw it over to you. What is one thing that you would recommend from a roadmap perspective and a company thinking through this?
So figure out what you want to do with cloud. So for example, if you're looking at both Azure and Office 365, you're going to need to make sure that the way you implement Active Directory and the way you implement your networking between your colo or on-premise environment, whatever that is, and that cloud is solid, and make sure that you design your descriptions properly, your subscriptions properly. So I think put a little bit of effort into completely outside of the workloads and completely outside of all of the stuff you want to implement in cloud. Make sure you get the basics right, because if you have to go back and unwind those, once you've started moving systems in the cloud, it's going to be orders of magnitude more expensive than it is doing it right up front.
Perfect. Love it. Kent?
I think the follow-on to that is capacity planning. I mean, it's what it always has been in IT, right? How do I make sure that I'm not buying too much or too little? The nice part about the cloud is that if I buy too little initially, buying more is not usually an issue. It's not usually that hard, but having an understanding of machine sizes and how much data am I storing and how much bandwidth am I going to need and those sorts of things, I think is critical to beginning that journey.
Perfect. Love it. So yeah, obviously what we've done here is scratch the surface of many more questions than we're able to answer in the time that we have. If you have follow-on questions, I want to encourage you to send a note over to us. Use the email address Microsoft@rackspace.com, and that'll come in, and we'll be able to track that and get answers back out to you. So Microsoft@rackspace.com. If you have questions specifically for the gang at 10th Magnitude, you can reach out to us. We'll get it to them. If you go to 10thmagnitude.com, you can find all their contact information there as well, but happy to help facilitate that conversation. Everyone, I want to thank you for enduring the hour with us here. This has been a really interesting conversation. We'll have more of these coming in the future. Obviously, these are more conversations than they are presentations. We feel like that really helps to communicate better. Please provide us some feedback. Reach out to us at Microsoft@rackspace.com.
Yeah, because we'd love to continue the conversation.
Absolutely, and we'll just open up a call bridge and chat. With that, Jen, I want to turn it back over to you and just say, everybody, thank you. We'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Well, it looks like we are just about out of time, but before we go, I'd like to thank Rackspace for making today's event possible, and I'd also like to thank all of our speakers and moderator for their participation in this great roundtable discussion. Just a reminder, this web seminar will be available on demand starting tomorrow, so please feel free to come back and review. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for attending.